Welcome to our panel discussion of the 2020 elections, what happened and why. I'm delighted to have with us today several eminent scholars of American politics and elections. We've invited in John Lapinski, who's on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania and director of the elections unit at NBC. And then we have several of our own Princeton faculty, Francis Lee, Nolan McCarty, and Ismail White, all of whom are joint in the School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Politics. We're going to allow the panelists to give a few comments, and I'll give a bit more detailed introduction to each of them, although as I told them ahead of time, we could spend the whole panel talking about their books and awards and papers, so we can't talk about all of that during the panel. But we'll give a brief introduction. They'll say some introductory remarks, and then we're looking forward to all of your excellent questions and allowing the panelists to answer them. Also, and as you know from the advertisements, I'm Brandice Canes-Wrone. I direct the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton, which joint with SPIA is sponsoring this panel. And I'm also on the faculty of SPIA and the Department of Politics at Princeton. So we'll lead with our invited guest, John Lapinski. As a professor, John writes on national elections and lawmaking. He has, although we can't have him at Princeton, unfortunately, at the moment, he has written several prominent books with Princeton University Press, including The Substance of Representation, and most recently with David Bateman and Ira Katznelson, Southern Nation, which examines the Reconstruction period. Today, we're going to hear a bit more about our current politics and his experience at NBC, where he's responsible for projecting the races in real time on election night and beyond, and working with the polls for NBC. So John, could you say a bit about the challenges of pre-election polling during this really exceptional time, both in our history as a nation, but also in terms of trying to project an election ahead of time? And, you know, we're getting a lot of questions already, both here for this panel, but in the public about what are we to think about the polls in general?
Sure. First off, thank you, Brandice, for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you. It's a real privilege. So let me just say, let me jump in and I'll talk about the polls. What I was hoping to do is talk a little bit about the polls and a little bit about a couple insights that I had on my job at NBC News and projecting elections. I mean, obviously, before I jump into that, everybody knows it was a very long cycle. It was a crazy election. It's almost impossible to go back and just even remember how this started with Iowa, right? And the caucuses. And I remember me coming in the next day at NBC News and just basically telling everybody I was bitter after staying up all night and waiting for essentially nothing. And as you can see, I've tried to spring back from life after this election cycle, but I have aged, and that was shown in a tweet that came out that claimed that everybody was certain that I was actually Steve Kornacki's father, which was slightly disturbing for him and a little disturbing for me too. So let's jump into the polls, because I think that it's really important for us to sort of think hard about the polls that we're conducting and what's whether how we're gonna conduct them in the future and what was wrong with them this cycle, because there's no question that the polls were wildly off. No, this is probably not a surprise to a lot of people when we actually go back and we look at the 2016 polls and the 2012 polls. I've been a part of the APOR task force that has evaluated polls, and we've known things for quite some time that, for example, the margin of error is way too small, and we know that there's been some non-response issues and other sorts of problems associated with the polls. But 2020 was sort of brought it to a whole new light, I think. And before I jump into what I think was wrong with the polls, I want to say, sort of what's the consequence of the polls being off? I mean, I think that we all know that there's huge consequences. One consequences is obviously it's sort of misinforming the public, but probably more important than that, and that's a very important thing, is that these polls, I mean, it wasn't, we were looking at polls, a lot of people were probably going to Real Clear Politics, maybe 538, other sorts of sites, and taking a look at these polls. But you have to remember that the number of polls that we were actually seeing was only a fraction of the polls that were actually being conducted, and that there were literally hundreds and hundreds of polls being conducted, both at the congressional district level, at the state level, and also at the national level, that were being used to make very consequential decisions, right? These polls were being used to decide which candidates to invest in and which candidates not to invest in, which states to invest in and which states not to invest in. And these had potential real consequences on how outcomes, how the election turned out, at least I would say in some congressional districts, and potentially for some state races. So when we think, oh, well, the polls are just off and it's unfortunate, we see a poll like ABC News put out a poll that said that Biden was winning by 17 in Wisconsin. Well, that was obviously wildly off, but we saw it across the board. So let's just jump into a little bit. Let's just jump into sort of what was going on, at least what I observed. And so there are two things that were, I think, really consequential, and both of them are going to be tricky, just for you to know, to fix sort of going forward. So maybe the most obvious issue, or not the most obvious issue, but the one I want to at least start with, deals with sort of turnout, and deals with, like, sort of what some of those assumptions that pollsters make when they weight their polls. So one of the things that we observed, and I just want to just quickly think about this in terms of Pennsylvania, is when you look at Pennsylvania, and if you break it down by either geo-stratification or party stratification, what you saw is that Pennsylvania, like other states, turnout was way up. And we saw this turnout was high across the nation. It was high in Michigan. It was high in Wisconsin. So if we think about these Rust Belt states, that was obviously important. But one of the things that I don't think that was not accounted for in our polling was that turnout varied by area. So if we were to look at Pennsylvania, turnout was flat in Philadelphia. Turnout was up about 4%, but it was up about 14% everywhere else. And so if you were to look at like different, high Republican areas to moderate Republican areas to very high Democratic areas, well, Philadelphia was completely different than the rest of the state. That was not accounted for in how our polls were weighted. And that in itself moved those numbers at least probably a point or two, maybe more in some instances. We saw similar things in Michigan and also in Wisconsin. Where we saw turnout flat in Wayne County, or not flat, but relatively flat compared to the rest of the state, and we saw the same thing and so that's in Michigan, and we saw the same thing in Milwaukee, for the state of Wisconsin. So right there, that was a big problem that pollsters really didn't account for, and it's also a problem that's really tricky because you don't know turnout until election night. We have better ability now to dig into the voter file and look at early voting and all these sorts of things before election day. But as we saw, is where there was differential turnout and it favored Republicans on election day. We did not know what that would be until election day, and so that does not help us. Sort of so what I guess I was trying to say there is that it's a tricky thing to deal with, if we actually want to get it right with pre-election polls. The other big issue with polling obviously deals with non-response. And that's probably, that's something I think that we can really do a good job of evaluating after the election. But solving that problem is going to be pretty hard. And so what we observed in these polls, and we've observed it in past elections, but it was much more prominent in 2020, is that there's a serious underreporting of Republican support. And I also want to just note that obviously we see this we see this most clearly when we're looking at horse race polls, but that obviously affects all polling. Right. It's not just going to be, who's winning. It's going to be, when we think about policy issues and when we think about Americans' preferences on, on a variety of different issues that sort of affect our government. That same sort of underreporting of Republican support is probably going to be underreporting of more conservative positions on a lot of these policy areas. And so it's not just a problem with our horse race polls. It's a problem with all of our polls. So the question is how are we going to what are we going to do about that? So the first thing we're going to do is we need to do a very careful analysis and try to understand that better. If the people, polling is built on cooperation. People have to cooperate. And what we've always hoped for a very long time is that even though we know response rates have plummeted, from, well over 50% maybe 20 years ago to under 5% now, it's not a problem, right? As long as that the people that we get are still representative, or we can make them representative through different weighting techniques. But if the people that respond and don't respond are completely different from each other, and they're different from each other, that makes it very hard for traditional weighting techniques to fix that problem in our polls, we have big issues. And sort of this gets at this whole idea of like, that we're missing certain types of Republican voters. We're getting Republican voters in our polls, but we're not getting the right ones. And the other thing that I've seen that's been thrown out there as a potential problem, not really related, but some people think it's related, is this idea that people are taking polls and lying when they're taking the polls, and that they're just not telling the truth. We've seen no evidence of this. It really is the issue of this non-response problem. And this is also where the idea of this, like, what President Trump is doing right now, and sort of really making this whole issue political, and breaking down trust in institutions like media institutions that conduct polls. This idea of getting cooperation for people to take our polls in the future is even going to be harder. I think it was very difficult in 2020. I think going forward, it's probably going to be more difficult. So that's where I think we land on the polls. We land in kind of a dark spot. And I think that media organizations like NBC and other, universities that conduct these polls are going to have to think long and hard about how we're going to conduct our polls in the future. I think what's going to be reported out in the future is going to look very different. I do not think what we saw in 2020 will be what we will see in 2022 in the midterms. Brandice, did you want me to talk about a couple other observations, or did you, about just calling elections and things like that, or did you want to save more of that for the Q&A? I had a few more things to say, but I don't want to overtake too much time. I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, I mean, if you have a few final comments, that's fine, but we would want to wrap it up in a couple of minutes to
let me just make two quick little points, just so that we can throw them out there for potential discussion in the end. So the second quick point that I want to make is projecting elections and how elections are conducted in this country have changed forever. My job now, which it used to be, and this is also going to have impact on people that observe elections, right? I mean, that, viewers at home. The new norm is going to be that we are not going to call winners on election night, at least in close races. You are not able to use exit polls, to make projections. And so contests are going to be 3, 4, 5, 6 days now, probably. I would be stunned if we were actually to determine who's going to control the House on election night in 2022. And that's just because, with people voting by mail, we had, 63% or 64% of Americans voted early, either by mail or in person. That's not going away. And then, so that's something to think about, because, it's really hard to take things back from people. And there's going to be, and the big question I think that centers around that is it going to be such a political issue? Like how you vote, whether you vote, by mail or early, is that going to be the same partisan issue that it was in 2020? And then the last thing I'll throw out is just, again, something to sort of think about, is because I think 2020 was a year where we were all surprised. We came in with priors, and those priors didn't turn out to be true. From a decision desk perspective, that was fine, because even though I have priors, I'm looking at vote data when I'm making projections, and it had no influence on my job about how I put in check marks and all of that. I realized on election night I was going to take a few days or more, but we adjusted, and I think we did actually a really good job. But some of the priors, and this is the things that we're going to have to figure out how to use data better to come up with better priors in the future. I mean, I think a lot of people came in thinking things like, for example, President Trump had solidified his base, but he wasn't going to get new voters. Well, we had almost 159 million people vote, and President Trump did very well with picking up new voters. We're still figuring out how many new voters, but that was that was really, really, really consequential. A couple other last two thoughts that I wanted to throw out there of things to sort of think about, and I think that were really sort of consequential and also important from a political science perspective, is that campaigns and candidates mattered in this election, right? I mean, so, Donald Trump had an approval rating in the exit polls of 50%, but his favorability ratings were 47%. And that's what he got essentially in the vote. And that difference between approval versus people actually liking Donald Trump, President Trump, probably is what cost him the election. I think people might be surprised by that approval rating, but I feel actually that our public polls were underreporting that probably throughout the year. The other last thing, and then I'll stop with this, is another sort of thing that I think people thought was surprised people on election night was the Hispanic vote. Everybody knows that the Hispanic vote is very heterogeneous, excuse me. But I think that people really were surprised when they saw, like, for example, how well President Trump did in Florida. In Florida, Biden won the Hispanic vote 52% to 47% for Trump. In 2016, it was 62 Clinton, 35 Trump. And what you saw here, and this is like where I'd say campaigns mattered, the Republicans did a great job in basically sticking the label of on Vice President Biden as being a socialist, and also being against certain policy issues that were very important to a number of the Hispanic groups in Florida. And so oftentimes we write about, oh, maybe the campaigns don't matter or the candidates don't matter. But 2020 was a year of exceptions. It was a year of exceptions across the board. And I think it's going to make us rethink how we do our work as political scientists. And I will stop on that.
Thanks, John. Incredibly interesting, and I know will prompt a lot of questions for the discussion. So next we have Francis Lee, who, as mentioned earlier, is jointly appointed in the School of Public and International Affairs in the Department of Politics. Francis is an expert in U.S. politics, and particularly in the areas of congressional politics, party politics, and representation. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has published numerous articles and multiple award-winning books, too many to mention here, but some of the recent ones include Insecure Majorities, Congress, and the Perpetual Campaign, and most recently with James Curry, The Limits of Party. So Francis, if you could say a few words about how you view the congressional elections as comparing historically, as well as what their implications are for legislative. I know we're still waiting on a few results, but what you can say about their implications for legislative politics over the next 2 years.
Thanks, Brandice, and thanks very much for organizing this great panel. So to state the obvious, there was no blue wave in the 2020 congressional elections. In fact, there was a small but distinct red wave. The competitive races in both House and Senate almost all broke for Republicans. Out of the 26 House races rated as toss-ups by the Cook Political Report, Democrats lost 25 and are down in the count for the 26th. 11 House Democratic incumbents were defeated, and the party may still lose more as Republican candidates are ahead in 4 more races that have yet to be called. Meanwhile, House Republicans lost no incumbents. House Democrats only picked up 3 seats. All 3 were open seats where the party benefited from favorable redistricting. Out of the 14 competitive Senate races, Democrats only won 4. So Biden will thus enter office with a smaller Democratic contingent than in the current Congress. Winning presidential candidates normally see their party's ranks in Congress at least modestly improved. Political scientists used to write a lot about presidential coattails and how they affected a president's clout in Congress. You have to go back to 1992 to see a new president elected with a similarly poor showing for his party in Congress. These outcomes were a big surprise, to say the least. Every well-known forecast projected that Democrats would expand their House majority. Most saw Democrats picking up 10 to 12 seats. Democrats, in fact, came perilously close to losing their House majority altogether. To compound the pain, most forecasts also expected Democrats to win a Senate majority. At this point, the best that Democrats can hope for is a 50-50 Senate. If Democrats hold on or manage to retain or to win the Georgia runoff elections, Biden would have, by the skin of his teeth, unified government. I would say that the likelier outcome is that Republicans will hold on in one of those races and Biden will enter with divided government. And divided government then would be the likely state of affairs for the whole Biden presidency because the president's party usually loses seats at the midterm. So let me turn now to offer a few thoughts on what these outcomes mean for legislative politics in the next Congress. First, the elections will have ramifications for internal party politics in the House and the Senate. Rank and file members look to the party leaders to manage the party's collective efforts to win or to hold majority control. Members naturally have more confidence in leaders who appear to be successful in these efforts, and they have less confidence in those who do not. To say congressional Democrats are disappointed in the outcome is an understatement. 2 days after the elections, Democrats held an emotional 3-hour meeting at which moderate members blamed progressives for embracing messaging such as defund the police that got used in attack ads against them. Progressives, in turn, responded by pointing to the importance of engaging with the young people and urbanites who support the party needs. One progressive member accused moderates of only caring about appealing to white people in suburbia. It was not a pleasant affair. None of this bad blood is good for holding a party together on tough votes. It appears that Nancy Pelosi will have no difficulty winning re-election as Speaker, but Pelosi's reservoir of trust among her members has been depleted, not enlarged. Democrats will worry about their electoral prospects in 2022. Outcomes like this foster an everyone for him or herself outlook. Meanwhile, Republican leaders are basking in congratulations. At a moment like this, nobody is second-guessing them or quibbling about strategy. Senate Republican leader McConnell already commanded great trust among his colleagues. This outcome cements it further. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has elevated his reputation. The upshot is that Democrats, at least in the near term, will likely have more challenges with internal cohesion than Republicans. Second, the midterm elections will loom over the next Congress as House Republicans see themselves as within easy striking distance of retaking the majority in 2022. The party not controlling the presidency has gained seats in Congress in every midterm election since 1860, with 2 exceptions. Republicans will only need to flip a handful of seats to get there. They will be focused on doing what it takes. Biden ran as a candidate who could unite the country. But Republicans will want to make the case that Biden and the Democrats are overreaching and misgoverning, and that a Republican Congress is needed to check their power. Looking back, McCarthy himself will recall how effective a tough confrontational approach had been in dealing with President Obama. After a Congress in which Republicans had refused to work with Obama on stimulus, financial regulatory reform, and health care, House Republicans won a resounding victory in taking back the majority in the 2010 midterms. McConnell, too, was Senate Republican leader under Obama and had pursued a similar strategy of confrontation and non-cooperation. His efforts were rewarded with retaking the Senate majority in 2014, a Congress of unified government under President Trump, and a long stretch of being able to confirm conservative judges to the federal courts. With a track record this successful, Republicans will likely follow a similar playbook in dealing with President Biden. The politics of COVID relief will be very much affected by the Georgia runoff elections. If Democrats win these races, a reconciliation bill that can pass the Senate on a simple majority vote becomes possible. And Democrats will be in a stronger position to get more of what they want in the relief package. But if they come up short in those Georgia runoffs, any deal will probably have to be negotiated between McConnell and the administration, with Pelosi's Democrats expected to accept what can pass the Senate. That was the pattern in Obama's first Congress, in which the challenges of passing something through the Senate trimmed the wings of the House majority. Speaker Pelosi probably had better leverage on these negotiations before the elections, in that the Trump administration was negotiating primarily with her on the expectation that if a deal could truly be struck, it would be hard for Senate Republicans to refuse something that President Trump asked them to do. Based on the polling projecting large Democratic gains in the 2020 elections, she probably expected that she could afford to hold out for stronger leverage. That appears to have been a miscalculation, unless Democrats manage to pull out 2 wins in Georgia in January. Taken together, the 2020 elections did little to clarify the direction of the country. Instead, Americans have, amidst intense party polarization, decided to give neither party effective control. With extraordinarily narrow majorities in both House and Senate, sweeping action on controversial issues will be largely off the table. It's possible Democrats might get a shot at one reconciliation bill if Georgia is kind to their hopes, but little else will be done on party line votes, regardless. The Senate filibuster will not be reformed. Party leaders in both House and Senate will struggle with member management. As has been the case since 2018, much of what the next Congress does will be accomplished in large omnibus bills negotiated across the four corners, meaning the majority and minority leadership of the House and the Senate. This doesn't mean that the next Congress will do nothing significant. The current Congress has done hugely significant things, most notably the gargantuan CARES Act addressing the pandemic, truly unprecedented in size and scope, by far the largest stimulus package in US history. The next Congress will be similar, or could be similarly consequential, but it's not likely to do much that moves policy in either an identifiably liberal or conservative direction. Back in 2000, during the Bush versus Gore recount, commentators started calling the United States a 50-50 country. 2 decades on, little has changed. Elections are more competitive and they're more expensive than ever, but they don't settle major questions of public policy. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. Next in alphabetical order, we have Nolan McCarty, who's an expert on US politics and democratic political institutions more broadly. He's the author of scores of articles and several books, including with Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, Polarized America, The Dance of Ideology and Unequal Riches. Since 2010, he's been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Nolan, I was tempted to say you are the leading expert on polarization, but I realize there's going to be someone who hears this video and takes umbrage, but you're clearly the expert or one of the main experts on polarization. And so given your expertise, can you say a bit about the extent to which the 2020 elections reflect established trends in polarization? Are they going to bring together Mitch and Joe, or are the overwhelming the institutional forces just too great?
Well, actually, I think Frances should be the one that takes umbrage because she's also the leading expert.
Okay, well, there, I knew someone would, yeah.
In fact, a lot of what I will say will kind of echo many of the themes that came out of Frances's talk. So as Brandice mentioned, I've spent a lot of my time studying the dynamics of party competition and polarization. And trying to address questions about the underlying causes of polarization and its consequences for governance. The basic story of polarization in the US over the past 40 years has been one of asymmetry. It's mostly been a reflection of the Republican Party moving to the right and a Democratic Party that's been fairly stable in terms of its preferences. It's always had a moderate wing and a progressive wing, but there hasn't really been substantial change in the composition of the Democratic Party in the same way there has been in the Republican Party. So one of the things that I've really been focusing on over the past year during the election is that we're starting to see some of the changes in the Democratic Party that we once observed in the Republican Party. So what I want to do with my few minutes here is to talk about where I see some of those changes, how it might affect the Democratic Party, and how it might affect polarization overall. So it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone who paid close attention to the 2020, both presidential campaign and the congressional campaign, that we have seen an emergence of a more visible, perhaps larger progressive wing in the Democratic Party, a wing that's identified more with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez than it is with the more centrist vision of the Barack Obama administration. To sort of highlight the tension, that movement is very good at kind of new social media and has a prominence and a visibility that probably exceeds its size. So that's one issue that's been very difficult for the Democratic coalition to manage, is that there's an insurgent movement that's been extremely good at getting attention through various forms of media. A second issue for the Democratic coalition has been related to the issues that political scientist Jonathan Rodden has written about, which is that Democratic voters tend to be very concentrated into urban areas. So if you think about the political geography of the Democratic Party, most of its voters live in cities. A very substantial part of its voters live in suburbs. But because of the way we elect congressional members through single member first past the post elections, a very large number of Democratic members are elected in landslide elections before electorates, which are, extremely progressive, liberal on a variety of kind of social and progressive issues. But there are just not enough districts. And so a Democratic Party that wants to be successful, wants to maintain control of the House, has to also be competitive in the suburbs. So what we saw in 2018 was a resurgence of competitiveness of the Democratic Party in the suburbs, which allowed them to retake the House of Representatives, but not the Senate, given the Senate is configured differently. But the headwind that they face coming into 2020 is this new prominence of the progressive voices coming out of urban centers, who did face very different electorates than the successful suburban Democrats of 2018. And so it allowed for an opportunity, both because the Warren Sanders AOC wing was very prominent in the media. It also provides some opportunities for the Republican Party to use their positions in their messaging. And of course, with issues arising related to police brutality and others, ones in which the kind of progressive urban base of the Democratic Party cared a lot about, it gave voice to messages like defund the police, which were, as John mentioned earlier, really important parts of the Republican Party's messaging. So the types of electoral appeals that were good for winning primaries in urban centers were not good for, I would argue, for winning, continuing to be successful in the Democratic suburbs. So we saw issues like Black Lives Matter, defund the police being used negatively against Democratic candidates in suburban areas, which presented lots of challenges for those candidates. Another issue for the Democratic Party, which is related more to the research of Matt Grossman and David Hopkins, is the fact that the Republican Party, which was somewhat successful in its efforts to kind of move to the right and polarize and win elections, is fundamentally different than the Democratic Party. So the Republican Party tends to be held together by a broad set of ideological principles, free markets, social conservatism, certain principles of how foreign affairs should be conducted. And their argument, the Democratic Party, which I think was very reflected in this election, is a coalition of different groups. It's a coalition of African Americans, Latinos, lower income workers in cities, but also professional suburbanites, people with very vast amounts of education. It's very hard to put together, a coalition across a broad set of issues that kind of link all of those groups together, which is one of the reasons why we do see candidates in, urban centers running on Democratic candidates in urban centers running on different issues than we see candidates running in suburban areas. And that split, I think, hurt the party. Again, which was kind of reflected in the kind of mixed verdict of the election, where, as of right now, it looks like Joe Biden's lead in the popular vote is going to reach 6 million votes. Yet this underperformance in the House and the Senate that Frances described, and I would add to her description, a huge underperformance of the Democratic Party in state legislative elections as well. It really seems like, and I think Frances made this point as well, that, if we think about the electorate, it's almost a verdict that they wanted. They viewed Donald Trump as a very polarizing figure. They wanted to get rid of him. At least 6 million more people wanted to get rid of him than wanted to keep him. But at the same time, they felt that there were elements of the Democratic Party that they also found very polarizing. Whether the criticisms were fair, I mean, the Democratic Party is not a socialist party that wants to defund the police for the most part, but the fact that there are strong voices carrying those messages in the party made it easier for Republicans to campaign negatively against those incumbents. And so we see greater polarization because now there is a hollowing out of the Democratic center, making the differentiation between the Republican Party, what's left of the Democratic Party, greater, and putting a new president in the unenviable situation that Francis described, having to govern without a significant amount of partisan legislative backing. So I would say, the ultimate verdict is that 2020 was quite a polarizing election, but a distinct election in that we get much more polarization on the left side of the spectrum to counter the continuing polarization on the right side of the spectrum, suggesting, that things will probably only get more challenging as we move forward.
Thanks so much. So completing our panel is Ismail White, who joined the Princeton faculty this year after having been most recently on the faculty at Duke. Ismail's research specializes on Black politics, public opinion, and political participation. He's the co-author of numerous articles and publications, and most recently a 2020 book with Cheryl Laird, Steadfast Democrats, How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior, which is with Princeton University Press. He's on the board of the American National Election Study. And so, Ismail, we're thrilled to have you not just on this panel today, but sort of at least virtually here at Princeton and hopefully here in the office soon.
Thank you, Brandice. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of race in the 2020 campaign. I'm going to sort of try to highlight some of the points that everyone else made about the sort of complicated nature of partisan politics, but sort of think about the way that race factors into partisan politics, which as you'll see is sort of in a very much a kind of inseparable from understanding the politics of what's going on, and it's not just a result of kind of one person's efforts as much as it is a kind of both the desires of the parties and the a long history of sort of complicated relationships with racial minority groups in the U.S. So, I mean, clearly race played an important role in the election, and we had the George Floyd killing and the protest this summer that sort of raised awareness about police violence directed at Black Americans, and while this certainly was an important event to sort of highlight race, we can't underestimate the role also that the president played in sort of making race salient to how Americans think about politics. I mean, right now we're seeing this sort of blatant efforts by the Trump people, I guess, to sort of disenfranchise Black voters in Detroit and Atlanta and Milwaukee. All of these are cities with large Black populations, and the rhetoric around this is often centers on, these places being corrupt and there being fraud and all this, and again, with very little evidence to that fact. So, and this is not new for Trump, and in some ways, Trump is a lot like the sort of party bosses that existed back in the day, right? And that, and throughout his tenure, he seemed to not miss an opportunity, maybe intentionally, either intentionally or unintentionally, to sort of inflame racial tensions, right? And so doing things like calling Black members of Congress unintelligent and saying that white supremacists were fine people and implying that they liked them, you know, these are kinds of things that, you know, we often thought of as sort of outside of the realm of kind of acceptable discourse. You know, and while we sort of think that these kinds of ways of talking about race are sort of unacceptable, in many ways, it's sort of a predictable outcome of the sort of dynamics of party politics in the US over the last 40, 50 years, right? If you go back to the 80s, you will see that the composition of both political parties were largely white. I would say about 70% of both parties probably were white in the 1980s, you know, the early 80s. And you know, that, you know, with that, I think the important distinction is that they weren't very different in terms of the composition of white Americans, right? But with the shift of white Southerners to the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s and the growth of communities of color, many of whom remain off-put by the Republican Party's embracing of this Southern faction, the Democratic Party became significantly more racially diverse and the Republican Party to some extent more white, right? And today I think it's probably like, if the last time I looked at the poll number, the survey numbers, I think the Democratic Party was like 60% white and the Republican Party like 85% white, right? And what Trump has done better than his predecessors, who often appealed to, you know, as Nolan mentioned, the sort of principles that underlie the Republican Party, what Trump has appealed to is this sort of this other common denominator that everybody kind of, you know, pretended didn't exist, that united Republicans. And this was whiteness, right? And it are a set of issues and appeals that sort of center on the cultural whiteness to some extent. So things like, you know, referring to things like working class Americans and, you know, but even the more blatant stuff that I just mentioned, right? And the fact that 60% of white voters still supported him despite a lot of what he says that this strategy may be somewhat effective, right? Now, on the other hand, what happened in Georgia suggests to me that that this particular kind of Trump strategy is not necessarily a path to future electoral success. I mean, certainly, you know, you would think of Georgia as this southern state, right? You never think that Georgia would be a blue state, at least, you know, as a person who grew up in the South, I would never have thought that. But on the other hand, you know, my understanding of the sort of demographic changes that had been occurring in Georgia over the years, you know, when I went to this HBCU in Louisiana and everyone wanted to move to Georgia, right? And so it wasn't just Blacks moving from the North to the South. And this was part of the big change in Georgia, was the kind of large growth in the Black population and kind of exponential growth of the Hispanic population. But the Hispanic population was starting from almost zero. So the Black population was fairly significant before. So, you know, everyone wanted to go to Atlanta, right? And I say like a third of my friends left Louisiana and went to Atlanta or to Houston. And, you know, that is partly responsible for what we see in Georgia. But of course, you know, Black voters aren't the only reason. I mean, Black voters themselves couldn't have brought about this outcome. Georgia, you know, in the particularly Atlanta suburbs, has been diversifying in terms of its white population as well. And so this is, so in some sense, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, Black people won the election for Biden. Well, you know, they were necessary but not sufficient segment of the population of Biden's supporters, right? It does seem that suburban white voters played an important role too in sort of helping bring Georgia along for the Democratic Party. The electoral consequences of race are a little different for Florida, as John mentioned, right? It's also a rapidly diversifying population, yet it's still in Trump, and I think the biggest distinction is between these two states has been the fact that a lot of Georgia's population growth obviously is among Blacks, but in Florida is among Hispanics. And Hispanics tend to sort of split their vote in different ways, more evenly across the parties than with Black Americans, as they are more reliable Democratic supporters. And then lastly, just to sort of wrap up, I'll mention a couple things about the sort of consequences of the sort of Biden election for racial politics. And I mean, I don't expect much, obviously, as everyone pointed out, it's going to be extremely difficult to get anything done, much less racial policies, which are always hard to get done. Even under Obama, they didn't get anything done. So, there's no hope, right? But you can expect at least a more compassionate approach to sort of thinking about racial politics, things like immigration, right? Perhaps the rhetoric will be more compassionate, and if not the sort of way the policies are executed. The same is true with criminal justice. I mean, Obama, there was a lot of talk in the Obama administration about criminal justice. He did a good job making people feel better, but not really changing a whole lot. So, I think in the end, there's going to be some, perhaps racial minorities will feel better, but there's not going to be a lot done, I think. I'll stop there.
Okay, not the most optimistic note, but we're asking people to be give us their unvarnished view. So a large number of questions have come in, and we'll start with one. Francis, one is very specific to you, and it seems that someone has read a lot of your work. So we always like that. I don't have a name, so I can't tell if it's a student or an alumni or member of the public. But they'd like to ask you, knowing that you've argued that as part of candidates' pitch to voters, they're kind of looking for reasons to oppose the other party. But while they agree that that's broadly true, I'm reading this pretty much verbatim, they're wondering where in this election, were there individual races where the Republican candidates won on a finding common ground message? And I'll just expand their question. Perhaps there were Democratic candidates, but I think they're focused on the Republicans given your comments. Francis, okay.
Did I get, can I be heard? Okay. That it's an interesting question. I can't think of candidates that ran on a message that was, that departed strongly from the party platforms, the standard commitments, the ideological commitments of the two parties, that did well. That where it seemed to make a big difference. That in the end, these elections really turned on the same electoral map we've been looking at for years. When Ismail defeated, they were in Trump districts. That in most cases, the exceptions were the South Florida members who lost because the turn in the Hispanic vote, which has already been noted. So I see the elections, even though campaigns can matter, I see the election's big picture as being very much a story of the red and blue map that we've been looking at, and very little breakthrough. It's not surprising that the election in 2018, where Democrats turned out in higher numbers than Republicans, with Trump not on the ticket, but with Trump back on the ballot, what you saw was something closer to the 2016 electorate, albeit enlarged by primarily the story that we get coming out of this as we interpret the election, which is that we need to understand that these commitments in these party coalitions are enduring. and that any shifts are only at the margin.
So Francis, you led into the next question without knowing it beautifully. So thanks for that really helpful answer on multiple dimensions, both for the content and the lead-in, which is that there are a series of questions about that build on Ismail and John's comments about the Latino vote, and some also on reports of a Black vote increase for Trump. Though I realize the vote is still coming in, and some of the mail count. So the Republicans appear to have added a multi-ethnic bloc of blue-collar workers. This questioner asks, to their longstanding coalition of wealthy people, small business people, and farmers. So what does this mean for the Democratic Party, and what should the Democrats do? And obviously you're welcome, both any of the panelists, but I know John and Ismail, you work in great detail with these numbers, so you can also push back on the media's conventional wisdom as well. But assuming you've granted the media's conventional wisdom on Latino voters already, so what does this mean for the Democrats?
Do you want to start first, Ishmael, and then I can jump in? Is he saying me?
You can go ahead. Sorry, you can go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that what we I think for the Democrats, first of all, in the Florida case, which I think is the most prominent, I think that was an instance of where the Republicans were just pretty savvy and actually sort of, I think in especially for the top of the ticket with Vice President Biden, obviously mischaracterized his position. As Nolan had said, whether you like Biden or don't like Biden, he's been around for 150 years and he's not a socialist. And so the Republicans really sort of took advantage of, being pretty nimble on the ground and understanding that, who these Hispanics were, right? Obviously the Cuban American vote has been sort of, we've known a lot about that for a long time, but there's also in Florida, you have a lot of people from Venezuela. With the hurricane, there were a lot of people that came from Puerto Rico. The Republicans did a really good job in sort of mobilizing and getting differential turnout amongst some of these Hispanics, and the Democrats did not. Some people have suggested that it was that some of these voters are low propensity voters. And the Republicans did a better job in sort of mobilizing them and with some of their GOTV efforts and all of that. So the question is I think for the Democrats, I'm not so sure that the Republicans have a hard grasp on some of these voters. I think that, but I think the Democrats have to think a little bit harder on some of the issues that are important to these voters. And as you had pointed out, when you look at the border counties, and this is something that I think Nolan could speak to in Texas, Hispanics are pocket voters too, right? And they also are business owners and other sorts of things. And so I think the Democrats sort of took them for granted. That said, I don't think that that the Republicans necessarily have a hard grasp there. I'd leave it to Ismail to talk about some of the surprising results that we might have seen on African American voters, where we saw, even though obviously African American voters came out on par with what we saw in 2016, I think that people were surprised that they were going to expect that the Democrats they thought had made, I think, better inroads in 2020, and some of the results that we saw come out of North Carolina, potentially even out of some of the Rust Belt states, I don't think met the expectations of the Democrats.
Yeah, I think that's right. My sense is that Black turnout, as John was mentioning in the first part, was unchanged for the most part. Despite increases among whites and turnout. So it is sort of a kind of interesting puzzle to sort of understand what's going on with Black voters and why there wasn't that level of enthusiasm. It's complicated, sort because the Black voters are already participating at a fairly high rate, given the sort of level of resources they have to sort of engage in politics. So that's one thing, but I do think there were some failures perhaps on the Democratic end, and I think the Democratic Party wasn't doing a lot of mobilization, was my sense, given the sort of restrictions of COVID. And so there wasn't a lot of like, you know, rallies and things like that, the kinds of things that sort of motivated many of the Trump voters didn't sort of exist on the Democratic end. And so maybe that played a role with Black voters and Latino voters as well. The increases are just, in terms of Trump support, are kind of smallish, but they seem to be more concentrated among African-American men, you know, and that may be some suggestion of the kind of maybe Trump's masculinity appeals that he constantly makes. I don't know, and that may resonate with some Black men who kind of see Trump's success as a businessman and things like that as, you know, kind of aspirational to them. I don't know. I'm just kind of making that up because it's such a small number in terms of his changes. You know, you kind of like, well, it's 82% still supported Biden. So you explain it, and the difference from Hillary was, you know, 90. So it's sort of it's difficult to explain those sort of smallish changes, right? Because obviously, if those masculinity appeals are pulling them towards Trump and race is pulling them another way, it seems like race won. You know, so anyway, but I do think over the next few years, you know, political scientists are going to, we're going to come up with some answer, those of us who study REP, to sort of think, race and ethnic politics, to sort of think about what would happen with Black voters and Hispanic voters. I mean, again, you have to think about the distinctions here. Hispanic voters, though, you know, many of the Hispanic voters are actually white. And so there's a difference between, you know, the sort of race and ethnicity and the kind of complicated nature, as John was pointing out, of it, sort of nationality, that make explaining, that prevent us from having a kind of generalized explanation across these two big groups of people.
Thanks. Okay, we have a large number of questions about Trump, and we really have time for one more question. So I'm going to lump a lot of them together. So these include, you know, what will Trump leave? And then a lot of questions that do presume he's leaving, which is, will he run again in 2024? What's he going to do during the transition? And then also why so many Americans still support and admire him. So you know, given the wide range of expertise we have on the panel, that leaves a lot for different people to weigh in on. Nolan, maybe you'd like to start, since you haven't responded to one of, you know, there hasn't been a question directed at you.
Sure. I didn't want to tackle that, but I did want to, you know, follow up on John's suggestion. I might have something to say about the border. I think it's important to realize that, you know, especially the southern Texas is a long established community. It's a middle class rural community. It's typically Mexican, who's been there for multi-generations. It's not really been affected by immigration as much as Hispanic communities everywhere. So I think it was just a false, as John said, it's just a false presumption to think that this middle class rural community, for which like law enforcement officer is one of the most predominant professions, would vote the same way as some other Hispanic community in some other part of the country. So I do think the media needs to do a much better job of understanding these differences across those communities. On Trump, I think he will. I think he will leave office. I don't think he will concede. I don't think he will attend the inauguration. I think he will have to hope that Twitter doesn't cut off his Twitter account when he's no longer considered a world leader and gets the kind of Twitter immunity that comes with being a world leader. But irregardless, he's going to attempt to stay relevant, whether it's for a future political career or whether it's in order to create a new conservative media empire that's built around Trumpism as opposed to Fox News. I actually don't think he will get as far as to run in 2024. My guess is that he will want to stay in the conversation long enough to freeze out a lot of other candidates to keep that option open. He's obviously into nepotism, and so I think if he weren't to run, I think he would want to help other members of his family stay politically relevant. So I don't think he's going. I don't think he's going anywhere. I just think he won't run in 2024 because I think the vicissitudes of age and his obviously not great health will prevent that ultimately. But he's going to behave unlike any other previous ex-president, and that he's going to stay engaged. He's going to criticize both Biden as well as congressional Republicans. I once quipped that I'd hate to be Mitch McConnell for the next four years, because any effort to kind of reach out to the Democratic side by McConnell or McCarthy, for that matter, will be met with a Trump tweet. And so I think they're going to be in a very difficult and challenging position as long as he stays on the scene.
Francis or Ismail, John, would you like to weigh in? Yeah.
I could say just a few words about the policy landscape that will face the incoming administration. Like Nolan, I believe that Trump will leave office, but he's going to leave behind an ongoing economic and public health crisis on a huge scale. And so there's great pressure to act, but the politics of acting will be different under a Democratic president than under a Republican president. That Republicans in Congress were more willing to go along with large-scale deficit spending when asked to do so by a Republican president. They shared in the burden of governance with a Republican administration, and the state of the economy affects them. With a Democratic president, it will be politically more comfortable, ideologically more comfortable, to move towards a posture of more austerity and greater concern about deficits. And so it will be harder to address the crisis on the gigantic scale that Trump was able to do in the spring of 2020.
I don't have a tremendous amount to add, Brandice, other than that, because I think it's very hard to predict exactly what Trump will do or will not do. I would predict maybe he will not still be a Twitter user in 2021. We'll see, how that works out. And I will also predict that he, even though he has affiliation with the University